In my presentation, we're going to go over the challenges we see as salvers in OPA 90. We'll go over a brief review of what that is and the changes we've seen this year with the non-tank regulations. We'll do a brief case study that's actually during the era of these non-tank vessel response plan regulations for OPA 90, and then what we see going forward as big risks for us as salvers, as well as what we can do to be prepared together as an industry. So as the Director of Business Development, I must touch upon who we are. At the Marine Response Alliance, we are an OPA 90 salvage marine firefighting provider that is U.S. Coast Guard approved in all captain of the port zones. As opposed to the average salver who extended themselves into these regulations, we decided to come together as a group. So we're actually a partnership of McAllister and Crowley for our towage, Titan for our salvage marine firefighting, and a company named Marine Pollution Control for our lightering. We are one of 5 U.S. Coast Guard approved providers. That means there's only 5 of us to respond to all captain of the port zones in the United States. And for us as an American salver, it's especially important for us to be available in the U.S. to help protect our seas. So the OPA 90 tank rules, these were implemented in 2011, so most of you should be familiar with what they mean, but what this means is that all tank vessels must be engaged with one of these 5 salvage marine firefighting providers and list them in their vessel response plans in order to trade in U.S. waters. So you actually have a pre-arranged agreement with a salver. And for a lot of people, that's a very scary thing, but part of these regulations were to actually drop the stigma of a salver, to cause a proactive arrangement with us and the ship owner on how to be prepared for a casualty, and some of what these previous gentlemen have discussed so far today. And I'll shortly talk about the non-tank regulations as well, but as of this year, every vessel trading in U.S. waters is required to have a contract with a salvage marine firefighting provider. So as I mentioned, we're covering all U.S. Coast Guard captain of the port zones. That's actually 17 different districts and 25 sectors. That's a lot of territory for the United States. And the original heart of these regulations, I think, were supposed to be more territorial, where maybe we would divide up the United States. But because we're salvers and we're extremely competitive, and the American Salvage Association came together and said, we can cover all captain of the port zones, each and every one of us. So there are very specific time frame requirements, which we'll go over, that actually list how we have to respond in each of these zones for time frames from everything from diving to having a salvage master on board, firefighting, and so on. Depending on the service encompassed, so depending on the type of incident, we have different time frames in the continental United States as well as offshore United States. These timeframes are strictly enforced by the U.S. Coast Guard, and we're constantly being audited by our geographic specific appendices, which is all of the United States, on are we able to respond in these timeframes. And for salvage, they get more specific for lightering, depending again on the type of incident, but because we're short on time, I'm not going to get into each and every one of them. This I wanted to put up on the screen for firefighting, and that's because it's our only response time that actually has to occur pier side. So within 1 hour, we must be able to provide a remote assessment, 2 hours an on-site firefighting assessment. So again, it shows you the amount of resources that we have to have available as a salver to be able to do this sort of response. So the non-tank rules, they were certainly the talk of the town for us in the United States, and if you're a ship owner trading in U.S. waters with non-tank vessels, for you as well. This means that now all vessels, that's mega yachts, cruise lines, container vessels, must be engaged with a contract with a salvage marine firefighting provider with a pre-existing funding agreement. And just up to a few weeks ago, we were actually extended a deadline, and we just finished with this paperwork. And trust me, it's a lot of paperwork to do. For us alone, we actually had 2,900 vessels that we had to attend to. So I think the big question is what we've seen since 2011 for the tank regulations and now with the non-tank regulations. And to be honest with you, it's really just been a handful of cases. It's not much. And many of of my owners ask me, well, Lindsay, what is the punishment for not activating your vessel response plan? Well, we don't have a definition for that, but please don't be the first one to find out. That's always what I say. And this has probably been our biggest challenge, is deciding when to activate the vessel response plan. And those are briefly described right here, or out of the guidelines. So the response plan is activated once the master has determined that the resources and personnel available on board cannot meet the needs of an actual or potential incident. Well, it's a very broad statement. And most likely you're a little bit afraid to activate your vessel response plan, because once you do, there's a lot of levels involved. But part of the reason that we have these regulations are to control us a bit as salvers. So if you have a soft grounding and you put us on notice, I'm not going to be sending out a naval architect, 5 divers, full setups, pumps, and so on. I'm just going to be looking at what resources I have available in terms of tugs, ready and available with enough bollard pull to take you off if you do become hard aground. And that's, again, the proactive approach to discussing with your salver on how this goes. So I'll take you through a case study. This particular case is a very interesting one. This was a car carrier. She was carrying over 4,700 Mazdas. She was en route from Japan to the US and Canada. She ends up listing 80 degrees. Now, she is afloat here, listing 80 degrees after the ballast water discharge gone wrong. So another US Coast Guard regulation, just a bit misinterpreted by the crew. This was pre-enforcement of the non-tank regulations, but the error of the actual OPA 90 regulations. So in this case, it actually happened where the owner had us listed as their salvage marine firefighting provider. They gave us a call. The gentleman on the side said, the vessel is listing 80 degrees, 80 degrees. It's an Asian owner, 80 degrees. We're saying 8 degrees, no big deal, 8 degrees, 80 degrees. So this was a very big deal for us. And of course, now this vessel starts to float into US waters, into Alaska, one of our most environmentally protected areas. In this case, our team mobilized Titan Salvage and Crowley Maritime for their tugs to support logistics, and we dropped our guys down by helicopter on board the ship. Now, a big issue here was also finding port of refuge. We've all heard about the big cases that have gone on this year, especially in Asia, and granting port of refuge by the Coast Guard is a hard thing to obtain. So in order to do so, we actually had to drop our salvage masters using rock climbing techniques into the ship. Car carriers, if any of you operate car carriers, the cars are held up by belts about this thick. So these guys are very intensely underneath, hanging with Mazdas above them, trying to find out where the water is exactly inside the vessel. And in this case, we actually created what was the first computer model on site to show where the water was to the US Coast Guard so he could grant us port of refuge, which he did in Dutch Harbor, as well as to perform a sequence ballast pumping system so we could then right the vessel. I like to talk about this one as well because it's one of the first that was used in the unified command structure. Now, if you have an incident in the United States, which, by the way, it doesn't have to be this big. If it's something small, it's going to be the biggest instance of your life. We actually operate in the unified command structure. It's operated by you as the owner, by your QI, as well as the federal on-scene coordinator, who's the U.S. Coast Guard. We work very well within this unified command, and this is something that we exercise in our drills, in our tabletop exercises, and so on. So we worked very closely in this case with the state of the Alaska. In this instance, in the Unified Command is all experts. This was one of the first major cases, as I mentioned, within the Unified Command, and we had about 40 people in this Unified Command Center. Now, just recently, we had 2 years ago the Kullik in Alaska. In that case, there were 400 experts in that Unified Command. So it's very important to know all of the participating parties. It's very important to know your salver, your QI, your OSRO, et cetera, because once these instances occur, there's many people that are going to be influencing how they actually get handled. And another reason that I brought up this particular case of the Cougar Ace is that her sister ship, the Baltic Ace, was not so lucky as to be able to be recovered. And by the way, I'm sorry, that vessel was returned to her owners after 24 days and is still operating today. Baltic Ace, not so much. This turned into a $60 million wreck removal. So very, very big discussion with Mr. Adams, of course. Now, it's a different type of incident, what happened here and that caused this vessel to sink, but in this region of the world, they do not have anything like the OPA 90 regulations. Actually, in the United States, as a matter of fact, we have the most strict regulations and the only ones for salvage that actually enforce these time frames. And I think this is a trend that we'll start to see around the world. We see this a bit in China with the oil spill, although it's a little bit backwards how that's going. I think we'll start seeing some changes in Europe and going forward and so on. A big discussion for us is in the OPA 90 regulations. We haven't really seen a current U.S. mega wreck removal. And I say mega wreck removal as my parent company, Titan Salvage, has completed the Costa Concordia. So we're very familiar with how this goes. And a hot topic is, what if the Costa Concordia happened in the United States? Well, what if it did happen in the United States? Do you think that the OPA 90 salver would be the one that continues on to get that wreck removal contract? I think very unlikely. I think most likely it will go out to tender and we'll see what happens if, God forbid, that happens in the United States at the time. But I could only imagine, and we could talk to the clubs about that, that it would go into the tender process and all of the salvers would have the opportunity to see who's best to attend to that particular wreck. One other thing. This just occurred in multiple stages. The first one for the Baltic Ace was the lightering. Cougar Ace, we did not lighter the bunkers. Now, I think that if it would be more current, that might be something that would have been enforced. But in that case, there was no threat to pollution from the bunkers. So the actual federal on-scene coordinator, the Coast Guard, did not require that. And I think that is a very interesting topic because that seems to be a hot push right now. And that may not be the right thing for the salvage operation. So what are the lessons learned thus far since 2011? Well, for us, it's really been, don't be afraid to activate your vessel response plan. There's no cost for us for you to put your salver on notice. Also, most of your salvers also have an international presence. You shouldn't feel afraid to give us a call and say, you know, this is something that may be small, but the smallest incident can turn into something larger. Let us have the opportunity to take a look at where our assets are. What is the most common instance that we've seen? And that's definitely groundings. So that's another instance that can start as something small to something large. And this is the SMART off of South Africa. Really don't let this be the result. Now, what are the growing challenges for us? It's definitely the increase in vessel size. You see here the Costa Concordia. She's only 290 meters long. So although the largest salvage in history, we're actually dealing with cruise lines that are 363 meters long. Our biggest concern, I must say, are the growing size of container ships. I was speaking to, I was reading some news the other day on the plane, and I read that Scorpio is now is preparing to charter what will be the largest ship on the sea, carrying 19,000 containers. The other day we had an incident with a ro-ro barge. She was carrying about 400 containers, and I couldn't get an exact roster of what was in each of those containers. Yet I, as the salver in the United States, this happened off of the Bahamas, had to be prepared to drop my salvage master on board by helicopter, not knowing what was flammable, what was chicken, etc. in each of these containers. And you're going to tell me with 19,000 containers, we know what's in each and every one of them. It's sort of a scary thing. So this is, how do we prepare for this? This is not just the salvers. This has to be the world looking at this together. We briefly talked about the firefighting side, and we saw those were our tightest time constraints. A fire on board a 19,000 container vessel would be a very serious incident. So, in truth, your salvers are not pirates anymore. We're your partners in compliance. We're U.S. Coast Guard approved. We work very closely with the IG group in order to prepare your funding agreements and how that works. I really suggest you talk to them. You talk to them about your trade routes internationally. What are their assets? What's available? You perform drills outside of just checking off the boxes. Right now in the United States, we have PrEP guidelines for preparedness. This has been only enforced for oil spill, but we're now going to see the final PrEP guidelines for salvage as well. And so what I suggest is, don't just think about the oil coming out of the ship, think about a major salvage casualty and be proactive, doing different types of scenarios, working closely with the salver. And thank you very much for your time.